So when I first came over to the States, my parents told me that what I told them was that I had been traveling from China in a wagon and had somehow gotten polio. And so then they gave me up for adoption, left me on the street somewhere where somebody was watching me to make sure that I was being picked up. And I do recall being on the street. I do recall feeling a little bit nervous and worried. And then I have some other little memories along the way, but then my other memory that's really very deep is remembering being on the plane ride from Korea coming over because I was lying on my back on the airplane seat, and I just remembered being extremely confused and baffled by how close the clouds were to the window. And so that was a very significant memory. I do remember other little bits along the way. So the issue about me being from China was because I apparently had spoken Chinese, knew some Chinese, and had very round eyes. And so a lot of people are saying, oh, but she doesn't look Korean. She's probably from North China. And so there were a lot of Chinese in Korea at the time, and that seemed to be a logical assumption. Later on, though, I did meet my birth mother and I did meet birth relatives, and then they poo-pooed that, and they said, no, you are 100% Korean. And then they told me the other story, which was that basically my mother had been raped. She had been working for in a tea store, tea shop, and she took me in. She cared for me for a couple of years and took me to my birth grandmother, her mother, to the farm. And there I was raised on the farm, so I have some memories of playing in the dirt and eating a lot of vegetables. I love vegetables, and then about 2 years, somewhere along the way there, they decided that as a single woman, she really needed to not have a child, and so her mother told her she should give me up for adoption, and so then they took me to an orphanage. I mean, they took me to the City Baby Hospital. And then from there, I was there about a year and a half, 2 years, until Harry Holt found me from the Holt orphanage. And once he took me in, then I was living at the orphanage until the time that I was processed for adoption. When you go back in my records, and I was looking at some of my documents from last night, from years ago, one of the common themes that came about was Harry Holt saying, she's a little fat, you're a little Myungja, but she's a good eater, and she's got a strong character. And this theme would come through. And then there'd be these nurses and doctors that would be doing their exams of me and seeing me, and then there'd be quotes from them saying, she's a bit plump, and then they'd say, but she's a good eater. And I just really was starting to get very annoyed at these references of me being a good eater. It's like, this is all you all remember about me, is I was a good eater and I was plump and fat. And then I learned later on from some Koreans that being a good eater, especially at that time, was really a sign of survival. That many people weren't good eaters; they weren't eating, and so if they didn't eat, they would die. In my case, because I had polio, and I think that there was something about being somewhat bedbound at the time, because I didn't really have braces and things to walk with. That the nurses all spoiled me. So I got fed way too much. And so there's pictures of me where I'm sitting there in the hospital bed with a very huge fat tummy, round cheeks, and little legs. And I feel like I was a little Buddha sitting there, just a little fat Buddha. And growing up, I always loved food. I was always a big food eater, and even today, I'm a big food eater. I love food, and I write for Korean Quarterly. I do their food articles. I do R&D constantly. I love having parties. I think food is a big theme for those of us who were adopted, who were orphaned. So that was my early memories of growing up, and that's my background. And growing up in Oconomowoc, I grew up in a small town near Milwaukee, and it was a very small community, very white. Everybody knew my father. He was a doctor in the community, and my parents were the pillar of the church. They were the same religion as Harry Holt, which probably explains why they learned about the orphans in Korea, and then they decided to adopt, so that's kind of my background there. While I was in Korea, though, somewhere along the way, no one was able to explain at what point I got polio. So not only did I have polio, but then I also lost part of my hearing. I lost my right ear hearing and part of my left. In the right ear, I got, no one knew why my hearing was gone there, except one day my mother was cleaning out my ears and a petrified boxfly fell out. And so then it became very obvious that there was apparently some fly had laid an egg in my ear, and the egg had hatched and eaten my eardrum. So my parents were the pillars of the community. They were the ones that everybody knew. So growing up in a very small community with my non-biological but also adopted Korean sister, we were the only two non-whites. My parents had a very good friend who was a photographer at the local community newspaper. And so every year, and very frequently throughout, because he was a family friend, he would take pictures of us. And so we grew up actually being rather celebrities because it never failed, but every few months there'd be pictures of us, and there'd be the my parents' adopted daughters, in the pictures. And I got to a point where actually I learned how to pose because he'd come through the camera and I'd grab a doll and I'd say, "See my doll," stuff like that, because it just became one of those routine things where he was always taking pictures of us and there was always stories of us in the paper. I didn't really have much of a Korean identity and much of a world, I don't think, that would be abnormal or different from anyone else. However, I do know that there were certainly the racial taunts. There were certainly the teasings and the trippings, because with my walking and carrying things, I did have experiences where I was being tormented. But, I think that deep down inside me, I was strong enough that I didn't really let it bother me. I understood it. I knew what was going on. I didn't like it, but I didn't cry over it. I didn't agonize over it. I certainly wasn't like what you see happening in schools today where young people suddenly lose it and get violent. I never got violent. I just kind of accepted it as being part of my fate. This is what I had to live. But, I got to a point where Ashley, you actually joked about it. You'd make little chink jokes and you would do things, slant-eyed stories. You did that to be fitting in because that's what everyone else did. They come up to you and say, "Oh, I can tell you a chink joke," and they go like this, and you just kind of go, "Oh yeah," and you start to smile and laugh and kind of try and push it away. It wasn't really until I was in college and in graduate school that I actually started to sort out my identities, my multiple identities. My identity of being disabled, having a disability, my identity as being a woman, and how do I feel about female issues, my identity as being a woman, of color, of being a first-generation Korean adoptee, and getting to know more about the different kinds of populations and my values and how people perceive me. So it wasn't really until I became a graduate student that I actually did a lot of researching and started to learn more about what it was to be my identities. But the real pivotal moment became when I got my first full-time position at Michigan State. And I was the very first person ever to be hired to be an Asian American liaison to a group in a particular department. And up until that point in time, I had not really thought about me being Asian American, but I've been curious about stories about Asians and people with disabilities. And unfortunately, stories about people with disabilities are all very negative. They would be stories like Heidi, where Heidi had to help her very selfish friend who had lost her ability to walk. They were stories about other people with disabilities who were very selfish and very self-centered and never thought about their able-bodied friends in terms of how they were holding them back. And so when I went to graduate school, I had to take a course called Human Relations, which is required for student teachers. And that is when I really had to come to terms with what people were seeing in me. And that is when I had to really start to question how I thought I was being seen and what I really thought about who I was. Now I identify as a person who is an Asian American. I am a person of Asian descent. I am a person who has a disability. My impairment is polio. My handicap is mobility. and my disability is not disabling unless I face social barriers. So in 1994, and I was about 33 years of age, which we can splice that out so that no one knows my age. Anyway, about that period of time, I got a phone call from my parents, and they said that they had been contacted by an orphanage, by the orphanage, Holt Orphanage, and they were saying that someone was looking for me, someone who claimed to be a biological relative. And they were very concerned because they didn't want me to be hurt. They didn't know how I would take it. And I think that one of the things that people know about me is I don't generally tend to get really emotionally distraught or anything like that. And I was just very unemotional, Ashley. And I said, well, I certainly was curious about why they wanted to find me. After all, I was in my 30s. I was, adult. I was established. And why would they suddenly now be wanting to find me? Because in my perspective, my experience, I'd never heard of any other adoptee whose parents were out trying to find them when they were adults at that age. So it was very peculiar. So anyway, I did respond back to Holt, and I did say that I would be interested in connecting with whoever it was. And it turned out to be my maternal uncle. He claimed to be my uncle on my mother's side, and that he wanted to meet with me, and that this was very important. And then he said that my birth mother had passed away, but that it was important for his mother, because she was in her 80s, that she meet with me. And so that was kind of the story began. So my husband and I, we flew to a location to meet with him and his son, who was our translator. He was a young teenager, and he knew English and Korean, and so he was able to translate for me and my birth uncle regarding some of the stories and some of the pieces of our lives. He was convinced that I was a birth relative. And he and actually it became very obvious when we first met, because like I said before, when we first met, I immediately saw the family resemblance. I saw my nose, I saw my eyes, I saw my face, my cheeks and mouth, and it was just totally stunning to be with people who had my same features. So if nothing else, we had those physical features there to kind of connect us. We then talked a little while, and then that was the end of that visit. And then he invited us out to his house about a year later. And he said my birth mother would be there. And I was confused by that because I didn't know that. I said I thought she had passed away. And then it turned out that what they had to get used to the idea that I had been found. And so up until that point in time, they were telling the story that my birth mother had passed away, but that my actual birth mother did not have to have the stigma of having had a child out of wedlock. So when we did meet with them, we got to the airport, and when we got to the gate, it's kind of like one of those weird scenes where the elevator door opens, and there they were, and they were standing there with flowers and with presents, and it was my birth uncle, his wife, my nephew, and my birth mother. And when I first met them, she came rushing over to me and grabbed me and started hugging me and crying and just saying all these Korean words, which I had no idea what it was. I just was very unemotional. I just stood there like a stick. It was strange because I certainly felt like I should have felt something, but I felt no emotion. It was just extremely surreal. And then my nephew finally started translating, and he said, she wants to know if you forgive her. He said, she really wants to know if you forgive her. And I said, yeah, I forgive her, because I said, I understand that I was given up for adoption at a time that would have been just horrible for a single woman to try to raise a child with a disability. So yes, I do forgive her. And when he translated that, she burst into more tears and clutched me even harder. And then she was fascinated, of course, and appalled, I think, by the way I walked, because I had the crutch, I had a cane at the time, and she kept patting my legs down and trying to figure out what's going on. So later on, when we were alone, I did take off my pants and showed her my braces and my legs so that she could see that I really did have legs, but they were encased in braces. After we got to the house, and I met my birth grandmother, and then the story came out that she needed to see me, that the whole reason for the search to find me had evolved was because she had felt very guilty through the years for having been the one to push my mother to put me up for adoption. And she felt that in her 80s, where she was in life, that she didn't have long to live, and she needed that closure. She wanted to see me one last time. And so she was very happy to see me, and they gave us presents, and the presents were very, very interesting. There were clothes, and then my birth mother presented to my husband and me each a ring, and his ring had a very large diamond in it, gold band, and mine had what I thought were pretty little stones, red, yellow, red, white, and green. And I found out later on that they were all truly emerald rubies and diamonds, and it was very, very expensive jewelry. And so she said, "I'm giving you these rings because I missed your wedding, and so this is my wedding present." So then after those presents, then she presented with me more clothes and presents, and then, of all things, she gave me a package of underpants. I'm looking at that thinking, underpants? White cotton underpants? Okay. My birth mother, after she got used to the fact that I was there, had given me all these presents and all these other kind of things, she started nagging me. She started saying, "Your skin is too dark." This is all being translated dutifully by my nephew. "Your skin is too dark. Oh, your hair, we got to take you to the hair place and get your hair straightened." And I'm going, "No, you're not touching my hair." Because I'm thinking to myself, if my hair has just been permed, if I get my hair reverse permed, my hair would fall out. I mean, I just didn't think my hair could handle that, and I didn't want to, but she wanted to perm my hair straight. And then she was very upset because I was wearing black, and she said, "You shouldn't be wearing black, you should be wearing bright colors." And she was going on and on, and my nephew finally stops translating and says, "I think your mother is very strict." And I said, "Yeah, I think so." Once I learned more about her, and I learned about my birth date and my birth time, and the grandmother, they gave me presents of money and cash and stuff. And I felt very awkward about all that, but they insisted on it. And I felt very good because some of the initial worries about meeting them included, prior to meeting them, was, why did they want to meet me? Did they need a green card? Did they need money? What was going on? Because certainly we'd heard those horror stories. I was aware of them. When and it's happened very frequently with some of the adoptees I know, where they have been met by their birth family, and there's an expectation that now they should take care of their birth family because they're doing so well. And I was worried that that might have been my situation, but given the presents they gave me and all the other kinds of situations that presented itself while I was with them, there was none of that. They had the green cards. There was no need for me to be helping them on their naturalization process. They had money. My birth mother, as it turns out, after she left my birth father, I don't know quite how she came across the money, but somehow she managed to go to school, and she went to college. And she not only got an undergrad degree, but she got a master's degree. And after a master's degree, she then became the owner of a construction company. And so when I met her, she kept saying, "I'm rich, I'm rich. I don't, you don't worry about money. I can give you money. I'm rich." And so, not that she's giving loads of money, but each time I see her, I've met with her, she has given me a little envelope with money, which has helped immensely because not only am I a food eater, I really love shopping in Korea. My grandmother did pass away shortly after we met. I don't know if she was ill or not, but she looked fine when we met, but she did die shortly after, and it was wonderful to have met her before she passed. But my birth mother, she's doing fine. She's been retired for quite a few years. She's a Buddhist. She started chewing me out because I like kimchi and the spicy kind, because she didn't think that spicy foods are good for me. So she does not shy away from telling me what she thinks. Last time I was in Korea was in 2010, and at that time I was there as a guest of Seoul National University. And I was a guest of a particular geophysicist faculty member named Dr. Sang-Mook Lee, who is a well-known disability advocate, actually, in Korea, because he was leading a group of Korean students on a geo expedition in California when his van rolled over and he became a quadriplegic. But because he was so well known in Korea, so nationally, internationally known in the profession, they let him come back to the university to teach in his power chair, which for Korea is unprecedented. And even now, when you go to Korea, if you are in a chair, there are no accessible vehicles for wheelchairs. You have to have your own van, your own vehicle. And when you go through Korea, if you are different at all, you're stared at. And people are embarrassed, and family members are embarrassed, and so they keep their family members with disabilities at home. They don't let them out in public. I got invited by Holt to go to the first gathering in Washington, D.C., and that was, I think, in 2000, something like that. And I lived in the area at the time, so I decided to go. Up until that point in time, I really hadn't had much of a identity as being working with other adoptees. I certainly, because of my job, had worked with Asian Americans and Asian students and was certainly understanding about issues related to the Vincent Chen murder, because I lived in Detroit area at the time when all of this was going on. But it wasn't until I decided to go to the first gathering that I really got connected with other adoptees at the numbers that they were. And I can't remember how many hundreds there were there, but there were several hundreds. And when we got there, first of all, I was a little bit miffed, and I'm sure a lot of us were miffed. We had to submit pictures of our baby pictures. And it's like, why do we have to submit baby pictures to this gathering? But when we got there, I found out that we all were issued our name tags, which had our current American name or whatever our name was, and then our legal name, our Korean name, and then also our baby picture was on our badges that we had to wear. And we were like feeling really stupid, although we looked cute then. We were very cute at those age. We were placed at tables so that we were sitting according to the years that we had arrived by 5-10-year increments. And at our table, which was the oldest table, I was the oldest table. We were the ones who were mixed race. We were the ones with disabilities. We were the ones who truly, truly had been orphaned and abandoned. It became interesting to note as we started meeting the people from the other tables and other groups, that there were children there were people who were not orphans, that they were not from single mothers. They were actually products of a husband-wife marriage, but because they might have been poor, the social workers and other people had convinced them that their child would be better off being adopted and sent away. And so that was what they did. And so it was interesting to learn more about how other adoptees had been sent out from Korea and became more of a market. It was very much more of a marketing process. And as the adoptees got younger to the 20s, there was a lot of anger and hatred and resentment toward Korea, toward their agencies that processed them, and everything else. Whereas we, in the older group, we were rather placid. We were rather comfortable. We had overall been processed pretty well. We had been raised in some fundamental we had been raised in very fundamental environments, maybe from religious aspects, isolated, but overall we had been given a pretty good life. Whereas as the next group came through, we noticed that the screening perhaps for adoptive parents had not been as good. And so I knew of a couple cases where the children had been adopted and then had been sent away to many, many foster homes. And in particular, one adoptee had actually been adopted into the home of a registered pedophile. And he would insist that she come home every day for lunch, and he would rape her. And then he would feed her half a sandwich and send her back to school for the rest of the day. And so there were some very, very horrible stories coming out from the younger ones. And understandably, they were very, very angry, very upset, very, 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 very full of emotions, whereas those of us who were older were not. However, being there, then I did get to meet some adoptees from the general area where I was living. in DC area. It was nice because then we kind of bonded. We became very good friends, and the network of adoption of the adoptees was incredible, because up until that point it was kind of like a rumor. Oh, I think there's an adoptee over here, maybe 30 miles away. There's some adoptees over there. There's an organization over here. And for me, when I was growing up, there was no Camp Kimchi. There was no heritage camp where you went to go learn about your background. You were in fact adopted into an environment where the social worker said to the parents, treat your child like they are one of your biological children. In fact, ignore their Korean heritage and their background. So I had to learn with what it meant to look like what I did, even though internally I didn't think I was what they were thinking I was, to where I am today. I feel very comfortable with the fact that I am a Korean adoptee. I am proud of being one of the first pioneers. It's because of our experiences and some of my colleagues and other adoptees my age who published their very first anthology, their books, Finding Their Voices, and letting it be known that now there is this legacy of Korean adoptees being able to speak and to talk about their lives. And I have to admit that I sometimes get a little bit frustrated and upset with some of the more radical adoptees who are in Korea, who are advocating for the end of adoption, and who are really, really full of hate and anger toward the agency that I came from. While I understand their anger and frustration, they don't seem to remember that it's because of us older adoptees, nor do they remember it's because of the very agency that they're bad-mouthing that they even have the ability to speak the way they do in Korea. Because we know, those of us who came over as the oldest adoptees, we knew that my life, for example, and when I went back to Korea in 2010 to speak at Seoul National University, they loaned to me a scooter. And I was able to go through the streets of Korea in a very small, narrow scooter. And while I was in Korea, I saw a man crawling in the streets. And he was crawling because his back legs were damaged and were weak and useless. He had a cup in his hand, and that was how he was making his living. You know, I looked at that man as I'm driving by in my lone scooter as a guest of Seoul National University with my PhD from Michigan State University, and that could have been my life. So when I think about these people, these other adoptees, and I respect their right and I respect their anger, but I also wish that they would remember history and understand that it is because of the agency that first understood, and Harry Holt's vision, that all children deserve a home. It's because of that vision that I had the opportunity to be raised in a situation where I could have been educated, was educated, got a PhD from Michigan State University, have a profession, working in higher education, and being able to live the life I am.